Our last chapter is entitled Organizational Culture, wherein we will discuss how an organizational culture is built, how it's maintained, and of course its importance. An organizational culture simply means a shared value system, something that distinguishes this organization from other organizations. The organizational culture is more obedient or less obedient or more creative or less creative, more profit driven, more socially responsible, more caring, more paternalistic. There are many different ways in which an organizational culture can be expressed and many different mechanisms by which, or many different effects of which it can have on its individuals. Here are some characteristics of an organizational culture. Obviously, this is not an exhaustive list. This is a pretty comprehensive list, though. How much innovation and risk-taking is there in the culture? Is the culture much more conservative, where people just kind of let things be as they've always been, or do they want to try to have more development? Do they want to try to take risks and improve or increase and grow dramatically? Is there a lot of attention to detail, or does the company just kind of run through things? These can be double-edged swords, obviously. The more attention to detail, the better in some sense, but in the other sense, you may not be able to do things as quickly if you have more attention to detail. I mean, personally, one of my bugaboos throughout my work, throughout my career, has been my attention to detail. But on the other hand, sometimes I feel that I'm able to accomplish more because I don't get bogged down and I do something in 10 minutes when otherwise I would have done it in 30. And it may not be 100% perfect, but I can do 3 times as much stuff. I mean, that's, I guess, all these things are kind of a double-edged sword and can be positive and can be negative depending on how you look at it. Outcome orientation, are they more focused on the outcome of the company, or are they more focused on the process of the company? People orientation, how worried is the organization about the people that work for it, and maybe even necessarily also possibly the people outside the organization? Is the focus more on the team, or is the focus more on the individual? Is there more aggressiveness in the company? Is the company trying to always improve and trying to always grow and trying to always expand, or is the company more kind of complacent? And is the company stable, or is the company constantly changing? Culture is a little different than job satisfaction, although the two things do have some similarities. When we're talking about culture, we're talking about how employees perceive the organization's culture. What do people think? Whether a company is more aggressive or whether a company is more complacent really depends on the attitudes of the individuals who work for it. Really, the culture is the sum total of the perceptions, the sum total of the attitudes of the people that work for it. Whereas when you're talking about job satisfaction, you're talking about the responses of the work environment. How do they feel about the organization? The two things are obviously related. Cultures can lead to higher job satisfactions, but they're not necessarily one and the same. Companies could have a good culture and not as good a job satisfaction. And of course, job satisfaction is almost one dimension of culture, whereas culture can encompass many different ideas and many different dimensions. The other thing you have to realize about cultures is that they're not necessarily uniform throughout the company. Just because the company itself is aggressive, for example, you take a company like Apple, which is humongous, and generally has a reputation for being aggressive and trying out new things all the time, it doesn't necessarily mean that every department and every group has that same level of aggression and that same kind of attitude. It really depends. There is a dominant culture that expresses the core values of the whole company, the general idea of how the company focuses, and then you have subcultures which are based on the attitudes of the individuals. Subcultures can add or modify to the core values. They could also be, for example, antithetical to the core values of the company. You could have a company like Apple with a dominant culture of aggressiveness, but maybe the accounting department is very conservative. There's not necessarily a rule. Now, of course, it has to be influenced by the general culture of the organization. You don't. It would be a very bad idea for there to be completely clashing cultures within an organization, although it does happen, and that of course could create dysfunction among the organization. But you also have the idea that, especially in a big company, you might have subcultures that are not necessarily the same as the dominant culture. A culture of a company could be weak or strong. And again, I know these are value words that seem to indicate good and bad, but that's not necessarily true. If it's a bad culture, if it's a culture of antipathy or a culture where people just don't care that much, well, then obviously a weak culture is better than a strong culture. If it's a culture of working very hard, then of course a strong culture is better than a weak culture. But strong cultures, of course, have great influence on the behavior of the members, increase cohesiveness, which is the willingness and the effectiveness of employees working with each other, and results in lower employee turnover because everybody kind of buys in or subscribes to the idea of the organization. Whereas weak culture, where it's not a matter of enforcement necessarily, it's a matter of buy-in, another sports term that I keep using, where they say players don't buy into the coach's system, which means they don't necessarily believe it's the best system and they don't necessarily work hard to affect it. Well, the same thing is true when you're talking about an organization. When you're talking about an organization with a weak culture, that means there are other aspects of the organization that are counter to the culture. The culture isn't really bought into by all the people, and the people therefore are less likely to be cohesive and more likely to move on to other positions. And let's take a look at the difference between culture and formalization. Formalization is a concept that we've discussed many times. Formalization is the idea of having a set of rules that everybody in the company has to follow, and that things are very formalized, and there are manuals, and there are procedures. And a strong culture leads towards formalization. Formalization, big companies may have employee handbooks that are 100 pages long that have, a million different rules about how employees have to behave. Now, of course, if those are not enforced, then they're irrelevant, but assuming they are enforced, that leads to very high formalization. And culture can do the same kind of thing. If you have a culture where people work hard and people don't take off unless they have to, and people respect authority, well, then maybe you don't need as many specific rules, whereas formalization might be more necessary or more desirable in places where you have a weak culture. So a strong culture achieves the same end without necessarily having to go through all these highly bureaucratic regulations and documentation. Okay, so that begs the question, what do cultures do? What impacts? We all know what cultures are now that we've discussed it, but what effects can cultures have? Well, they can define boundaries. Boundaries meaning the limits of what is socially acceptable within the company, or fiscally acceptable within the company, conveys a sense of identity in the company. Do people feel that the company has a particular mission that the people subscribe to and that the people buy into? Generates a commitment to the culture and to the goals of the organization. These are all things, of course, strong cultures can do much better than weak cultures. Enhances stability within the company, and it also is a sense-making and control mechanism. There's a term that we haven't looked at before in this course. Making sense of things, making sense of procedures in the company if they all lead towards these ideals that the culture is able to instill in the employees. Cultures can also create what is sometimes known as a climate. Climate, of course, when we talk about the weather, it's warm, it's humid, it's dry. An environment. Well, here we're talking about an organizational environment. These in organizational environment or climate is the shared perceptions that the members have about their work environment. Do people generally have a positive attitude, or do people generally have a poisonous negative attitude about the people they work with, the people they work for, the organization in general? These are all things that a strong positive culture can obviously help the attitude of the people and therefore the climate. But then we have to look at the other side of culture. And I'm not just talking about necessarily a negative culture, a culture of resentment. That obviously could be negative. The reasons for that are fairly obvious. I don't think I need to go into them. But even a positive culture, even a culture of aggressiveness, or a culture of working hard, or a culture of stability, or, positive, good cultures can also have risks. Number one, Probably the biggest one, is institutionalization. Behaviors and habits go unquestioned. If there's a culture that, okay, this is what we do, then there's a tendency to say, okay, this is what we do because this is the kind of organization we are, and not necessarily question, is this a good idea? We don't engage in this kind of marketing because that's not our corporate culture. Our corporate culture is to get people based on word of mouth. Well, is that necessarily such a good idea? Maybe we would do better to do a little more advertising. Maybe we would get more customers. And to have a culture that says, well, we don't do this because we've never done it, and that's part of the company culture, may not always inure to the benefit of the business. Barrier to change, which is a kind of the same idea as we discussed a moment ago. Barriers to diversity, and again, here diversity doesn't necessarily mean racial or ethnic diversity, but it means diversity of viewpoints, of backgrounds. If this is the organizational culture, then maybe we only want to hire people who have similar attitudes, cultural attitudes towards us, towards that as we do. A company that doesn't put as much of a premium on its culture may look towards other backgrounds. Whereas if your culture is obedience, let's say, maybe you're only going to look for employees who have, a culture that indicates obedience. And similarly, barriers to acquisition and mergers, you may not necessarily want to buy another company if you don't think that that company has the same culture as yours. That could be a good thought process, but on the other hand, it could be a negative thought process because mergers, acquisitions are some of the ways that companies can grow and some of the ways that companies can diversify and get into new fields. And if you're only going to acquire companies that you think fit with you culturally, it's the sort of thing that could stifle the ability of a company to grow dramatically. Now let's move to a discussion of the life cycle of an organizational culture. Well, first, the organizational culture has to have a start. It has to begin somewhere. And that has to be in the founders of the organization, or at least in, the slide says founders, but at least in the people who are running an organization at the time that a culture is formed. A culture could change. A company could have been very passive and then all of a sudden become very aggressive because the people who are, I guess, the founders of the new culture, the people who are running it now, have a different attitude. Founders can create culture by hiring in people that think the same way they do, hiring people that are very aggressive, hiring people that are very conservative, hiring people that are, that like to work hard. That obviously is one way to establish a culture. Indoctrinating and socializing employees, even people who are there may not have had that attitude to start with, constantly reinforcing this idea through memos, through employee handbooks and manuals, through oral conversation. That's also a way to instill a particular corporate culture at in an organization. And then finally, the lead by example method. Number 3, acting as a role model. If people see that bosses, supervisors that they respect and admire are behaving in a certain way, that causes them to want to behave in that way. So you can create a culture by hiring people who already have that culture, by telling people to have that culture, although that's, not as effective, or by leading by example. And then you've got the idea, okay, now that you've got a culture that you like, how do we keep that culture? You can select those when you hire new people, select people who fit into that culture, or fire people who don't, or both. Establish norms by the actions of the management. Socialization, those are really kind of the same 3 ways as we discussed before, except in the second and third are in reverse order. Selection is really the same as hiring and keeping. Indoctrinating is really the same as socialization, and top management leading by example is really the same thing as, well, leading by example. Here is kind of a little chart that discusses the socialization of a culture. And socialization, again, means weaving an attitude into the thought process of an organization, almost into the DNA of an organization. Pre-arrival means knowledge about the organization to, at the very beginning, in regarding before the idea, before the culture is socialized within the organization. Then you have to expose it to the organization and change to fit within the organization. So this could be a socialization of an individual, it could be socialization of a group, it could be socialization of a process. In other words, you have to encounter the idea and you have to change your own attitudes to fit within a particular culture. And that, of course, can lead into increased productivity, hopefully increased commitment to the company goals, less turnover. At least that's the hope whenever you're talking about the socialization of a company. Could be negative, it could lead to negative outcomes and all these things, but the theory is that by establishing these cultural norms, you're hoping to excel at all these areas. So now let's look at various ways that you can establish this organizational culture by this socialization process that we've just discussed. These are all obviously things that are not mutually exclusive. You can do one of them, you can do 5 of them, you can do all of them. Some of them are a little contradictory to each other, but let's go through them very quickly. You can separate new workers for training. You can give them formal training. You can give them a class. You can make them every day come for an hour to a meeting to discuss the organizational culture, to discuss doing work. I mean, they say, for example, law firms, I don't know if they still do it, but law firms on Wall Street, when they'd hire 60 new people out of law school, and they'd get them together in a big room in the first couple of days and explain to them, hey, you have to work 100 hours a week, and you have to have your BlackBerry on you the whole time. I guess today it would be it would be a phone. You have to always respond to everything. You have to work very hard, and they were trying to give them formal training into the culture of the organization. That could be a collective on a group basis. Of course, my example was something that was formal and collective. It could be fixed, planned activities, or it could be variable. Again, on the right side, you have the counterpoints to that, where you could have formal versus informal, where instead of having everybody in a room, you speak to them individually. You could train them collectively on socialization, on group culture, or you can individual. Fixed or variable. Fixed means you have particular classes and particular timetables. Okay, you're going to meet every week on Wednesday from 7 o'clock until 8 o'clock to discuss it. Or variable, you just kind of do it whenever it happens. Serial, which means role models are used, not necessarily human role models, although they could be human role models, but it could be specific examples that are discussed. Or it could be just kind of random, where you don't necessarily use a particular example. I'm sorry that these two columns don't line up perfectly. Then you've got divestiture, which means you're taking away an old model to replace it with a new model, or investiture, where you're adding something to a new model. These last two are kind of for situations in which you want to change a company culture. You can say, well, we used to do things informally, and now we're not doing things informally anymore. Now we're doing everything formally and according to the rules. Or you could say investiture, we used to do this work, which is fine, but now we're increasing it by adding some sort of a goal. Here's some kind of a little bit of a summary of what we discussed before. You have a philosophy, and then you have a selection idea of how you're going to implement that philosophy, and that's through the management itself. Has to either lead by example or lead by hiring the people who are going to establish the culture, and that leads hopefully to an organizational culture. And really everything that we've discussed is based on those ideas. We discussed how the management can lead by example or lead by formalization or lead by establishing rules. Then you can socialize the culture, and then what you have at the end, hopefully, is the organizational culture that you were looking for. Now, that's all fine in terms of how the supervisors establish the culture. Let's look at it from the other side. How do employees actually pick up on the culture? Now, obviously, one way an employee can pick up on a culture is through that formalized training and bureaucratic employee manuals that we discussed before. But there are other ways in which employees can kind of pick up a culture as well. Things that are a little bit less formalistic, things that are not necessarily rules-based. Remember, things that are it's better to establish a culture that's not just based on rules, that's based on the way people in the organization perpetuate the culture by themselves. themselves. That's the sort of culture that, has a greater buy-in factor. You put it all in formal manuals, the employees might or might not buy in, but if the culture develops because of the way the employees act spontaneously, without being forced to, that has a much greater chance of perpetuating itself in the long term. Stories of the organization. Maybe stories about how hard some people work, especially at law firms. Stories about people working at 3 o'clock in the morning, 5 consecutive days, or accounting firms during tax season, or whatever it is. Rituals doesn't necessarily mean like religious rituals. This means what does the organization do? Do they have big kickoff meetings? Do they throw sushi parties on Friday? Do they have conferences? Whatever it is, these are things that can also help perpetuate the organizational model and organizational culture. Material symbols. Things like, almost the artwork on the walls, the symbols generated by the organization, the literature put out by the organization. These can also convey things, the degree of egalitarianism desired. Egalitarianism essentially means equality and making sure that everybody has equal access or equal outcomes in the organization. Is the employee motto greatness for the world, or is the employee motto profit for us? No, neither sounds like a very good motto for a company, but companies' mission statements, companies' documents, companies' mottos can all play into this idea of how employees learn culture. Identifying just the language in which the company acts and behaves are things that contribute to its culture. So that leads to the idea of, if you're going to establish a culture, and every company is going to have a culture. It could be a weak culture, it could be a strong culture, it could be positive, it could be negative, but every company pretty much is going to have a culture one way or the other. So how do you create one that's good, and how do you create one that is ethical? Well, a strong culture with high risk tolerance, low to moderate aggressiveness, and a focus on means as well as outcomes is most likely to shape an ethical culture. Ethical culture meaning, obviously, people that obviously want to make a profit and want to do well, but also want to do what is right. High risk tolerance means the idea of you're willing to do things even though you're not 100% sure how well it's going to do on the bottom line. Are you, if you're, let's say, an oil shipping company, are you willing to spend a little more to decrease the chance of environmental mishaps? Well, that might hurt the company's bottom line a little bit in the short term, but it's ethical, and it may have long-term effects because of better public relations and decreasing the possibility of a major oil spill, which could have all sorts of problems for your public relations. So if you have a little bit of risk tolerance, you can do things that are ethical, whereas if you have no risk tolerance and you want to try to be as conservative as possible, you may only be looking at your bottom line from day to day. Low to moderate aggressiveness is also the sort of thing, very, very aggressive companies that want to grow as big as possible are less likely to worry about things like ethical constraints. But regardless of the kinds of characteristics, any company can be ethical and any company can be unethical. Managers obviously have to be visible role models. If managers talk in a way that promotes ethics, that obviously helps tremendously. And if they behave in a way that promotes ethics, that helps by leading by example in terms of communication as well as behavior. Providing ethical training, seminars, things like that can help, obviously. Rewarding ethical acts and punishing unethical ones. Some companies do the opposite, where if people do things that are unethical but lead to greater profits, they get rewarded. Well, that is a counter-ethical organizational culture. And, of course, to provide protective mechanisms by which behavior that is unethical is corrected within the structure of the organization's regulations and culture. So you want an ethical organizational culture, and you also want a positive organizational culture. Organizational cultures obviously could be weak or strong, positive or negative. What are some of the things that denote a positive structure? Building on employee strengths, rewarding more than punishing, using more carrots than sticks. Obviously, some punishment and disincentive of bad behavior is necessary. emphasizing vitality and growth rather than being put down. There's one way to keep somebody in line saying you're worthless and I'm not going to be able to do anything for you unless unless you shape up. Or you can try to say, well, you can grow and get promotions and get raises within the company culture, if within the company's organization, if you behave in a way that's consistent with the company's values. Of course, then there are limits to positive culture, and because you don't want to pursue it past the point of effectiveness. Sometimes culture, sometimes people do things because this is the way we've always done it, or because this is the way it's done. That might not necessarily be a positive thing. You don't want to, we discussed before, always do it the same way simply because it's been done. You want it to do it only to the point that there's a reason for it. That's the dichotomy that we did way back earlier in the course between the J and the P, whereas the perceiver says, okay, we want to do it because it's useful, but the minute it's not useful, we don't want to do it anymore. And the J has more of a tendency, the judger has more of a tendency to say, well, this is the rule, so we ought to follow the rule. And that's, a dichotomy that you got to watch out for. And of course, both sides have positives and negatives. Following rules can help, but following rules when they're no longer useful or no longer necessary or no longer helpful can be negative. Global implications, again, every chapter is focused a little bit on dealing with people from different cultures. We have to look at managers being more culturally sensitive when dealing with people from other countries and other cultures, talking in a low tone, making sure not to get excited. Some cultures are okay with excited behavior, especially in a supervisor, like the United States, for example. Other countries, may not look as favorably to that. In Israel, for example, they don't mind. People generally don't mind being aggressive and loud and abrasive. Other countries would take a little bit more of a dim view to that. Speaking slowly and listening more. Avoid discussing religion and politics when you're dealing with people from other countries who may obviously have a very different view. And even aside from viewpoint, there's also the idea of what's considered offensive. Some countries might consider it offensive to discuss certain things, whereas other countries think it's just part of the normal behavior. And ethical decision can be culture bound as well. Different countries, different cultures have different ethical rules and implications. So being careful of all these things is necessary when dealing with a culture of people that includes other cultures. Then we've got some of these tips for managers regarding culture. Realize that an organization's culture is relatively fixed in the long term, but can be changed with a strategy. If you want to change an organizational culture from being always a 9 to 5 and do exactly what we're told and no more, to being more aggressive and more hardworking and more in tune and invested in the company, can be changed, but it has to be strategized. Change in the company culture just doesn't just happen because you want it to happen or because you say it should happen. It needs to be planned. That can be done by hiring individuals whose values align with the organization, and those employees, if they see things similarly to the organization anyway, are more likely to stay with the company and to be more effective. Understand that the performance and socialization depends on they're knowing what to do, giving them adequate training so that they have reasonable expectations of what they're supposed to do, and they understand what they're supposed to do, it leads to a better culture than a situation where there's confusion about who's responsible for what. You can shape the culture of your work environment, you as a manager, you as a founder, as somebody who leads a company. And of course, then finally, regarding global issues, your culture may not be transportable to other countries. If you're dealing with people in other countries and other cultures, you need to understand that your culture may not necessarily be synonymous with or can not be usable in that other culture. Okay, and essentially just kind of a review over here. Organizational culture develops over time and is really based on the commitment and values of the employees. Ethical and positive organizational cultures can be created, and we discussed a whole bunch of different ways to do it. And of course, national culture in which the organization sits, can influence the culture of the organization. And that's all for Chapter 16, and that is all for the course. I want to thank everybody for this review component of the course. I want to thank everybody for listening and for watching, and I encourage you to contact me with any questions. My contact information should be on the syllabus. Thank you very much. Good luck on the exam, and have a good day, everybody.